Hello learners, I am Dr. Aparna Samudra from the Department of Economics, RTM Nagpur University, Nagpur, and we are doing this particular course of Environmental Economics. In the first lecture of this course, we had seen that what is the definition of environmental economics. We have also seen that how the subject of environmental economics came into being, and we were discussing the various approaches of this subject matter of environmental economics. In this lecture, we will be discussing the nature and the scope of environmental economics. So, we'll understand the approaches. We had already done the 4 approaches in lecture 1. In this, we will be taking care of the technological and the socio-economic approach of environmental economics. Then we will discuss the nature and scope of environmental economics. Thereafter, we'll understand the significance of studying this subject of environmental economics. So let me just revise once again the approaches which we had done in the previous lecture. We had explained the natural resource scarcity approach by the classical economist. Thereafter, we had talked about the Marxist approach, ecological approach. Then we had seen the market-based approach of Chicago approach. Then we explained the conservation approach of Cap and Goulding. Today, we will be talking about technological approach and then the socio-economic approach. So, what is the technological approach to the environment? What does this approach explain with respect to this subject matter? This approach examines that what does the technological change do to the environment? How then when the technology changes, what implication does it have on the environment is studied by this approach. Barry Commoner gave the perspective of the technological approach, and he asserted that business firms primarily aim to maximize profits within the economic system. One way of increasing these profits is by technological advancements. But he says that this technological advancements, in order to get profits to the businessmen, comes at the cost of the environment. How? He says that it leads to the intensification of the pollution. He explained that the pollution tends to intensify due to the displacement of old, more friendly environmental techniques by new, ecologically faulty but profitable technology. That is, the old technology maybe did not give them a lot of profits, but it is displaced by the new technology which is giving more profits even though it is ecologically faulty. In these cases, what happens is that pollution becomes an unintended consequence of this economic system's drive for productivity. That is, in order to have more and more productivity, more and more profits, we sacrifice on the older ways of doing business. Probably those ways were more environmental friendly. For example, when we see the case of agriculture, the previous ways, the older ways of doing agriculture were definitely more environmental friendly, but because there was a growth in population and that required higher agricultural productivity, we have seen the rampant use of fertilizers and pesticides, which have of course increased the agriculture production, but has had an impact on the environment and also on the human health. Then, Commoner says that this is associated with the cost. He highlights that the cost of environmental degradation is then largely borne by the society as a whole in form of externalities. For example, if there is a fishing pond and somebody is overfishing, that community is overfishing, then what will happen is over a period of time, it will destroy the whole ecosystem, or the life below water gets destroyed. Because of this, the whole society would then face the damage caused even though the benefit accrue to only few. Further, Commoner argues that the post-war technological transformation witnessed in the USA since 1946 has significantly increased environment damage compared to the previous technology. Hence, the technological approach to environment is focusing on using technology which is more environment friendly. Alternative perspectives have been given by Schumacher, who has advocated appropriate technologies which are labor intensive, energy saving and producing minimal pollution while generating employment. Unlike the ones which we have seen recently, where machines are doing the jobs which men would have done. Because of excessive weightage on the machines given for the production process, there is rampant or very high use of energy. We use a lot of thermal power, because of which fossil fuels are burning. Not only it is causing pollution, but it also displacing humans, hence reducing employment. So Schumacher is talking about using technologies which are labor intensive, energy saving and producing minimal pollution while generating employment. Huber, on the other hand, proposes ecological modernization as an alternative to technological change. And he has given a term which is called as ecological switchover. In the industrialization process, that is, the industries, of course, they need to grow, but when they grow, they have to develop those technologies which are eco-friendly. And in this process, what is they are talking about is averting the environmental crisis. The next approach of the socio-economic approach to the environment has been given by Dr. Mustafa Tolba, who was an Egyptian scientist. He advocated the socio-economic approach to environmental policy, wherein he has emphasized the interconnectedness of development, human well-being and environment sustainability. That is, he is getting the human well-being also in the context of environmental sustainability. According to his view, environment as the stock of physical or social resources is available for satisfying human needs, and development as a process which is aimed at increasing human welfare. That is, the stock of the resources which are given to us by the environment, whether it is a physical resource or a social resource, it is there to satisfy human needs. And the ultimate purpose of environment here is the enhancement of the quality of life, starting with the satisfaction of basic human needs. That is, whatever the environment has given or whatever the development policies should be, they should focus on the enhancement of quality of life, which start with the satisfaction of basic human needs, which are food, shelter and clothing. He says that there is a very strong link which gets established between poverty and environmental problems, arguing that environmental problems stem because there is inadequate development, where millions of people lack basic necessities like food, shelter and education. Because they do not have access to these food, shelter and education, and the economic development has not reached to these people, they live in abject poverty. Due to this poverty, they overexploit the resources, leading to resource depletion, deforestation, loss of arable land, and the pressure on the fragile ecosystem, which exacerbates environmental degradation. So his view is that if we develop all the people together, if we get in the socio-economic development, that is, you are reaching to the unreached also, the environment which is getting degraded because the people who do not have access to resources, they overutilize the resources of environment which are available to them. So if we can bring them out of poverty, environmental problems can be solved. So he is aiming at the reorientation of the society's aim, and he recommends a society in industrialized countries which prioritize self-expression in culture, education and humanities. This shift should be less demanding on the environment and focus on conservation, resource reuse and reduction of waste and extravagance. So this is the approach of socioeconomic. Now, after understanding all the approaches coming under the subject matter of environmental economics, now let us understand that what is the nature of this subject. The nature of this subject will be fourfold, or we will be understanding the four aspects of the environmental economics. One, we say that environmental economics is positive and normative in nature, both. Then, it is the study of both micro and macro. It is static as well as it is dynamic. And then we say that environmental economics is a social science. Now let us understand all these points one by one. So let us first see that what do we mean by positive aspect of environmental economics and what do we mean by normative aspect of environmental economics. Positive aspect is basically a descriptive analysis of the environmental phenomena. That is, we are trying to understand that what is happening on the ground. So, what is situation is called as a descriptive analysis. Whereas, when we talk about normative aspects, it is a prescriptive analysis of environmental policies. That is, what should be, what ought to be, how it should be done is normative aspects. So, as you would agree with me, from the environmental perspective, first we have to understand that what is going on, and then we have to give a prescription to the solution that what should have been done. Positive aspects explains how economic forces impact environment, whereas normative aspects talks about or it evaluates how the environment should be managed. So the focus here in the positive aspect is how economic forces are impacting the environment, whereas normative will be focusing on how this environment should be managed. Whatever allocation of resources for the purpose of production and consumption has been done, and what impact it had on the environment will be studied under positive aspect. Whereas, when we try to understand now this has happened, how it should now be managed, the evaluation of that will be a normative aspect of environmental economics. For the positive aspect, the environmental economics uses empirical data and does a statistical analysis. Whereas normative is concerned with the value judgments and the ethical consideration. So what is given through the empirical data, the data which is collected on the ground, and after doing this statistical analysis, a description is given under the positive aspect. Whereas normative will focus on what are the ethical consideration, what is the value judgment, whatever has been done, is it right? Is it how it should have been done, or there is another way of doing it is given in the normative aspect. For example, if we want to analyze the effect of pollution on the GDP growth, is a positive aspect because we will have data on pollution, we will have data on the GDP growth, we will try to correlate this data and find whether there is any relationship between both of them, and if, then what? That is a positive aspect. Whereas, whenever you, after analyzing the effect of pollution on GDP growth, when we talk about that what should be done, should we have a stricter emission regulation? That will be a normative aspect. So purpose of positive aspect is to understand the environmental trends and dynamics, whereas the purpose of normative aspect is for advocating certain specific environmental policies. So that is the one aspect of environmental economics, that is, environmental economics will be both positive and normative in nature. The second aspect or the second nature of environmental economics we will be discussing will be from the point of view of micro and macro. So let us understand that how environmental economics is both micro and how it is macro as well. What is micro? We all know microeconomics basically saying that it is examining individual agents' behavior in relation to the environmental decisions. That is, how individuals are making their economic decisions with respect to the environment. This individual may be a consumer, this individual may be a producer. So how individuals are making their economic choices and how their choices are having an impact on the environment, or how they are making their environmental decisions, is the micro aspect of environmental economics. The second aspect is the macro aspect, wherein broader aggregates which affect environmental issues on the economy as a whole are studied. So instead of just focusing on one individual, one producer, one firm or one industry, macro aspects is taking the whole economy into consideration and studying the aggregate effects of the environmental issues. Micro aspect focuses on analysis of specific environmental markets. Because it is micro in nature, because we are talking about specificity, it is only considering any specific environmental market. Whereas macro aspect of environmental economics is talking about the overall environmental policies. So here we are specific, and in macro we are overall. On an aggregate what is happening we will be discussing. For example, in micro aspect, we may be discussing individual firms' decision to adopt green technology. That is, if an individual firm is talking about adoption of a green technology, having a green building, this is an individual decision. So that is a micro aspect. Whereas, if there are national policies which are made to address climate change, it is a macro aspect. In the micro aspects, various tools are used. For example, demand and supply analysis, cost benefit analysis, they are all used in your micro aspect. Whereas, when we talk about macro aspects, national income accounting, green GDP as we call it as, fiscal policy tools, for example, charging a pollution tax, giving subsidy who's using, let us say someone who's using for use of solar rooftops, that's a fiscal policy tool. So that is the difference between micro and macro. So as you will agree with me again here, that environmental economics does not only talk about the individual economic agent's behavior, rather it also understands that what is happening at the macro level. The second nature we will be talking about is the static aspect and the dynamic aspect. What do we mean by static? When we are talking about a short-term analysis, when we are focusing on the immediate impact of a policy intervention for a short period of time, it is called as a static analysis. Whereas when we talk about dynamic, we are talking about a long-term consequence or the feedback effect of a policy intervention. That is, immediately if I want to understand that what has been the impact of a decision, for example, in peak Delhi pollution, if the government of Delhi has decided that we will have cars with odd numbers and even numbers being on the roads on alternate days, and then we want to see the impact on the pollution, it will be a static aspect because we are seeing the immediate impact. Whereas dynamic aspect will be a long-term analysis, that if we take a policy that we will only have cabs and autos which run on green fuel, that will be a long-term analysis. Similarly, in static aspect, we examine equilibrium conditions at a specific point of time, that is as on date. What is happening in the equilibrium, that is studied under static. Whereas, when we consider changes over a time in the environmental system and economic activities, it is a dynamic aspect. For example, when we say that world is now becoming hotter, or we are seeing a lot of climate change happening, or we see that the groundwater depletion is taking place over a longer period of time, it is a dynamic aspect. Static aspects has certain fixed parameters and conditions. The variables are fixed and conditions are fixed under which we are doing this analysis. Whereas in dynamic, because it is a long-term analysis, we see changes happening over a period of time due to economic growth, due to technological advancements and environmental degradation. In static aspect, for example, when we do a cost-benefit analysis of a pollution control policy in the current period, it is a static aspect. Whereas, when we want to model the impact of climate change policies over the next century, it is a dynamic aspect. So, environmental economics we will be seeing will be both talking about the static and the dynamic aspect. The fourth point we said with respect to nature of environmental economics was that environmental economics is why it is a social science. Why is in nature it is social science? One, environmental economics is interdisciplinary in nature. Why? Because it draws upon the insights from various disciplines. It is not that environmental economics is only concerned with economics or environment. It also takes into consideration the ecology, sociology, political science, and of course environmental science to understand complex environmental issues. What type of society do we have? What type of political structure do we have? Do we have a democracy? Do we have a socialist economy? Do we have a dictatorship? What type of a political structure we have also has an impact on the policies which are going to be made with respect to the environment. Therefore, environmental economics, we say, is interdisciplinary in nature. Second is that environmental economics as a social science is a behavioral analysis. All of you will agree with me that whenever we are talking about environment, whenever we are talking about adoption of a renewable resource, or for example, if we talk about whether we should have rainwater harvesting in our houses or whether we should have solar rooftops, this is all about the behavior. This behavior may be individual or this behavior may be collective. So what is the behavior of the people, their preferences, and what incentives are there which can influence them to get favorable environmental outcomes is also a part of environmental economics. Also, environmental economics talks about policy analysis. That is, it assesses the effectiveness, efficiency and the equity of the policies and regulations which are with respect to environment. So, how effective the designed policies have been or the regulations have been to get the desired results is very much a part of environmental economics. Then, of course, sustainability. Environmental economics talks about that how economic growth, technological innovation and policy interventions can promote sustainable development. How we can talk about intergenerational equity is a part of environmental economics. Now, after this, understanding the nature, now let us go to the scope of environmental economics. The first thing under the scope of environmental economics is about resource allocation. That is, environmental economics analyzes that how various resources are being used among competing users, considering that there is a trade-off between economic development and environmental conservation. That is, you either can have complete economic development giving disregard to what is happening to environment, or we can just conserve the environment and do nothing for the economy. And nobody would talk about such a policy. Hence, there has to be a trade-off between how much development and how much environmental conservation. So, environmental economics therefore analyzes that how are the resources allocated amongst these two uses of economic development as well as environmental conservation. Second, it talks about the policy analysis. It evaluates, as we have just seen earlier, it evaluates the effectiveness, efficiency and equity of environmental policies. And not only that, in environmental economics, we also assess the impact of these policies on social welfare and environmental justice. A very important aspect, as we have seen in the subject matter of the Chicago School, they say environmental economics is to be studied because markets fail to allocate resources properly. So, market failure, how it should be tackled, how it should be evaluated, and how the resources should be distributed so that this market failure does not take place is a scope of environmental economics. Then, the valuation of the ecosystem. As we put value to the humans, if we are employing someone, we pay them certain wages and salaries, we are valuing the human capabilities. But what about the value of ecosystem services like clean air, water and biodiversity? So, in environmental economics, we do this environmental valuation so that we have an informed decision making and we promote and conserve efforts for the environment. And then, of course, as we have said earlier, environmental economics is very closely associated with sustainable development, wherein we are talking about balancing economic growth with environment protection and social equity. And of course, how we can forget the climate change mitigation. Because when climate change is happening, it is happening in the environment, but it is having an impact on the economic growth. So, it addresses the problems and the implications of climate change and talks about those policies which can mitigate the greenhouse gases and how to adapt to the changing environmental conditions. After understanding the nature and the scope of environmental economics, now let us learners have a look at the significance of environmental economics. Why is it important and how it is gaining traction, particularly in this period where we are seeing so much of climate change. So let us see what is the significance of environmental economics. Environmental economics, firstly, helps us to understand some very important and controversial issues such as climate change policy, nuclear power, recycling policy and traffic congestion charging. So these policies which are always talked about, that is, should we have a nuclear power? Because we say it is, but it's dangerous also. What should be done with respect to recycling of the waste which is, which takes place because of both the production and the consumption process? Similarly, should we charge the traffic congestion? Should there be a fees on the traffic congestion? Such important and controversial issues are understood once we know what is environmental economics. Then, it also helps to optimize resource allocation by understanding that there is always a trade-off between economic development and environmental conservation. So how the natural resources should be effectively used is understood by way of environmental economics. And as we have already highlighted, it addresses the market failures which are related to environmental goods and services like pollution externalities. And because of when we address these market failures, automatically we get to more efficient market outcomes which improve the economic welfare. Thereafter, environmental economic studies also help to foster international cooperation and coordination. We have all seen that how under COP26, COP27, or when we talk about WTO, or whenever we talk about any multilateral agreements, the question of environment challenges arises. So when people talk about these environmental challenges at the global level, which may be deforestation, which may be biodiversity, through agreements and treaties, these can be solved. And then, of course, as we have seen in the nature also, environmental economics is interdisciplinary. It collaborates with other disciplines, which helps to have as a multidisciplinary study instead of being in silos. I'm doing my job as a physicist, you as an economist is doing your job, but environmental economics brings us together, wherein we are talking about making those types of materials which are not only environment friendly, but which are also cost effective. So that's a very important significance of environmental economics. So let us just have a recap of whatever we have done in this particular lecture. We have said that in its scope, environmental economics is both positive and normative, micro and macro, static and dynamic. Also, we have talked about that how the scope of environmental economics talks about resource allocation, policy formulation, climate change mitigation, all towards promoting sustainable societal well-being. So, that is all for this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.